Cool. Well, hello, welcome again. I'm Cameron Cundiff, and thank you all for coming today. It's a joy to have you all here in our new space. Thank you, Adobe, for hosting us. Yeah. And a heartfelt thank you to Thoughtbot, who has in the past hosted us for over 4 years. And yes, thank you. Thank you, Thoughtbot. If you're watching, thank you very much. So we'll be here from now on. This is our new space. I'm also a co-organizer in addition to the speaker. You might have seen me running around organizing. So that's what that's about, and that's why I'm filling you in. We'll be here ongoing in the new year, first Tuesday of each month in this space. So follow us on the Meetup group and get announcements for what's next. I'm going to dive right in now. Well, sort of, you'll see. I'm going to start my presentation at least, and we'll go from there. I named this talk Designing for Accessibility in Adobe XD. You'll have to bear with me for a little bit because it's not going to seem like that's what we're talking about, but I promise it is. I'm a painter by training and by education. Professionally, I'm a software engineer. I'm not a designer in either aspect, so that might be a surprise to you. But it's okay, I promise. It'll be good and educational because my background as a painter has informed my practice in accessibility and my practice in voice design and my practice as, well, I guess a designer. Does anyone here, I'm going to describe this image. It's a pixelated picture of a man in a blue beanie. Does anyone know who this is? Zeldman, yes, Jeffrey Zeldman. He is a pioneer in the web standard space. I read his book in 2002, something like that, and it really turned me on to the ideas of semantic web, accessibility, and progressive enhancement. So hold that thought. Also, further down the line, through a variety of careers, and having moved from art school into like sort of basic HTML coding to more recently voice design and voice technologies, I started getting into devices like Alexa and Google Assistant and thinking about how does that fit into visual design? So 2 things so far, right? Progressive enhancement and voice UI. The final piece is where I've come now. I'm a software engineer on Adobe XD. I work on the voice features in Adobe XD, voice and speech playback. And I had kind of an aha moment after going through, I mean, that was basically like 12 years in a 2-slide format. Through that journey, I kind of came to a realization, and it culminated with my work on XD. The realization is progressive enhancement. It's related to progressive enhancement. It's related to painting, and it's related to voice technology. And to illustrate what I'm trying to get at, I want to show you a little video. This is me painting with Adobe Fresco. It's a screen recording of me painting a portrait. And so, oops, I'll pause for a second. So this is a very classical approach to painting. And what you do classically, like from a Flemish painter standpoint in painting a portrait, is you have a ground. It's a whole production. I mean, you could spend days just preparing a canvas, but you have a canvas with gesso. You paint it with a ground. You have like a neutral color. And then you start to do a lay-in with vine charcoal, just sort of a light illustration of what you're trying to capture. And then you do like a stiff brush, really rapid sketch with like a dark color. And you start to build up, not piece by piece, but all at once, you build up this form. And so this is my background. This is my background. Like having this experience in painting has informed where we're going to go today. So to describe here, what I just described, doing the lay-in, doing the sketch, starting to put in the darks, the lights as general forms, starting to put in the background, blocking things in, and building up like globally in like loose, slowly more refined aspects. So I did promise this is a talk about Adobe XD, and a talk about design and a talk about accessibility. So let's see how all of what I just showed you fits together in a live demo. So what I want to try to do here is show you a process, a framework for thinking about designing for accessibility. Accessibility here means to me maybe more inclusive design than compliance. It means making content available in a multimodal experience to a broad range of sensory experiences. And the framework I've kind of come to think about that is progressive enhancement and that layering technique. So starting with a blank canvas, we want to kind of just map out a flow. So we're going to start in prototype mode. I'm going to do like a little arcade game, right? You know, like a dungeon crawler, and see how the principles that I just described can be used in XD to build a multimodal experience. So the first thing that we're thinking about is multimodal and experience and sensory-based, driving this out from a sensory-based experience. From an accessibility standpoint, the most design starts from visuals. From an accessibility standpoint, that doesn't always add up, because I would say at a baseline, and I'm going to elaborate on this more later, but at a baseline, really it's about text. Text either as auditory text, so read aloud, text as a command or an action, text as captions. You need the seasoning of visuals to make that come alive. But at a baseline, we're talking about text, and naturally that flows into voice. So if I wanted to design a dungeon crawler game, naturally I'd want to start from a landing page, like sort of you open the app. And thinking about this from a screen reader user standpoint, say I have very low or no vision, what would the experience be like? I'd be using a screen reader, so we need some sort of speech playback. So I'm going to add an interaction. And can you all see that moderately well? Okay, I'll describe what's on the screen. I'm going to actually change the screen resolution real quick. Pardon me. Jolly, is this going to throw you off entirely? If I, okay, I'll try it. Extra, scaled.
While Cameron futzes with his resolution, there are a few seats that are available if you'd like to fill them in and sit down.
Okay. A little bit better, right? Tiny bit? Thank you. I'll describe what's on the screen as well, because that would be in good taste and good practice. I'm working in Adobe XD right now. And I'm in prototype mode. I've got a few canvases up. I just duplicated a handful of canvases. And in prototype mode, you can attach interactions to objects. And those interactions have trigger, like tap, voice, time, drag, and the actions are like outputs of that trigger. So more recently, we have speech playback. There's also auto animate, transition, etc. And so what I've got here is my first artboard, and I'm attaching an interaction that's time-based, and I'm going to have it have speech playback output. I'm just going to go through each of these canvases and add what I want to hear as a screen reader user, kind of like I was describing before, like doing the lay-in, right? That's what we're doing right now. The first one, I put the title of the game, Dungeon Crawler. The second one, I'm kind of imagining, okay, I would probably go to a character chooser screen. Okay, so choose your character. I can kind of start to imagine this coming together as a screen reader user. Next, you probably want, so you've got your character, you probably want some sort of exposition or description of the landscape. Okay, so we're starting to get more of an arc. I've written, you find yourself in a dark room, there's something else here. Sort of a prompt to do something. So we'll leave that, because we don't really know what that prompt is going to be yet. Now, if I just play this right now,
Dungeon crawler.
okay, so there's nowhere to go from here. So I need to link these together, right? And this is where you start to think more creatively, like visually, yeah, you'd have a button, but what does that mean for someone who doesn't use a keyboard or mouse? Well, we've got voice commands. So I've written in kind of the general buttons, if you want to call them that, or commands that I want to apply to get the result, which is what I just sketched out. And I'm gonna wire these up to have a voice command that corresponds to the visual action on the page. And so what this means from an accessibility standpoint is you're starting to drive the visual experience from the experience of someone using assistive technology. In this case, you can think about voice control or speech recognition and dictation.
Dungeon crawler.
It says dungeon crawler. Oops. Try that again.
Dungeon crawler.
Start.
Choose your character.
Druid.
You find yourself in a dark room. There's something else here.
Search. Okay, so I haven't put anything on the last page, but this is starting to come together as like, if I didn't show you any of this, it starts to come together as a coherent experience for someone using, for example, an Echo Dot, Alexa device, or for someone using a screen reader or voice control. This is not sufficient for a visual display. I mean, it works, and that's something, but the idea here is, well, let's dig into that. Why doesn't it work? For one, these need to be clickable. If I can't vocalize, if I don't communicate verbally, voice control's kind of out the window. I'm probably using a visual UI. And according to our handy dandy authoring guidelines, there's very clear specifications about how a button should kind of work, right? And one of those things is that buttons should all kind of look the same, and they should kind of communicate their affordance. We've all kind of have a picture in our head what a button looks like. I think I'll illustrate accordingly. Some rounded corners, n'est-ce pas? That.
You could move the stool so it's in front of you.
Yeah, well, I didn't want to like pull out any cord. Yeah, I'm gonna pull out cords. I'm definitely gonna pull out cords. And then for placement, we never got to the last step of what did we find? Let's see. I'm going to put a time trigger, so that basically means that when we land on this artboard, it'll immediately trigger the action.
Dungeon crawler.
So the same kind of interaction works now with a tap. See, I've got a tap action, transition, tap action, tap action. So suddenly we've got
Dungeon crawler. Choose your character.
Druid. Druid.
You find yourself in a dark
Hard
room.
word.
There's something else here. You found a staff.
So I think you're starting to see how this could progress into a more sophisticated UI. Couple of caveats. This is exceedingly difficult to do live in front of an audience. And also, visual design is not my strength, so I'm not going to belabor the point, but I did want to show you this process of building up, right? Building up from a core experience, which is basically the experience of someone who has some sort of disability. And generally speaking, I start with voice and text, specifically text, because that has like the most outputs, and build up from there. Oh, so let's talk about color. Again, I've got a couple of swatches that, if you don't know about this website, adobe.com, .io. Oh, thanks very much. This is Adobe's color swatch creator. You can export color schemes from here to your Creative Cloud libraries and use them in XD. So I wanted to touch on this because it's a very common go-to for designers is to think about, I think often like in the same way that developers think about alt text as like the first thing when someone says accessibility, they're like, oh, alt text. Designers think color contrast, and that's important. It's kind of like multiple steps down the path that I was just going, but I wanted to call it out. Creating a swatch, like a series of assets, and then vetting them against a plugin like Stark. So for example, I have this button. I'm going to make it purple. I'm going to make the text kind of brown. I am suspicious that this will not meet color contrast guidelines. And there's a hotkey, which I think is Command-Shift-H. Yeah. So that just opens the action in Stark. It's a deep link. But they have a couple of handy pointers here, which these map to WCAG guidelines, WCAG AA, requirements around contrast. So normal text for AA, standard 4.5 to 1. So what I would suggest is, right now we're at 1.26. Use this plugin to sort of like, once you've laid out your general palette, apply it to your design, and use that plugin to then evaluate your contrast and adjust your palette accordingly. So if you use it in the assets panel using components, you could say, okay, I want this brown. I want to add this brown to my colors. Really hard to see this because it's over here. That's just how bad the contrast is. Add the colors. So using this color as an asset, you can go back and say like, oh, this is clearly too light against that green. I'm going to change it globally like a variable you would do in programming. So that's my recommendation for strategies around color and color contrast. So I'm going to pause there for a second. The other approach, or I guess thinking you have to consider is developer handoff. So this is like, as a designer, you're sort of building from scratch. You're doing a greenfield design, and you want to build foundationally on accessibility and inclusive design as a principle. What happens when you hand it off to a developer? There's a couple of ways that you can go about doing that. One is using annotations. I've shared this asset out in the group. What we're looking at is a group of identifiers, annotations, little boxes that have modifier keys, tab order, letters, so that you would use in like a screen reader context, assistive technology output, and regions. Also, there's tab order direction arrows, and you would actually pull up your design and annotate your visuals accordingly. So for example, I'm going to show you. If I wanted to show that Command F5 is opening VoiceOver, then I could actually use those annotations adjacent to the design. Command, well, this is a bad example because this is assuming the assistive tech is already open. If I wanted to go right, I could use tab and the tab order. And what that looks like in like a finished design is something like this. This is a little bit of a variation on what I just showed you. It uses the spirit of those annotations to simulate a screen reader experience.
VoiceOver tutorial. VoiceOver is the built-in screen reader on Mac OS.
This is all designed with native features in Adobe XD, including voice commands, speech playback, and key commands, which is something. Look at my prototype, it doesn't sound like I turned it off. I've applied, you leave for 1 minute, Jolly, and everything goes downhill. I've applied a keys and gamepad trigger, and you can specify a key. In this case, the key that VoiceOver supports for the rotor is Control-Option-U. That's right?
Welcome to Mac OS. VoiceOver on. Headings menu.
All right. Headings, and
Press the number 2 to filter the headings list.
Level 2 headings.
Use the down arrow to focus the next menu item.
Billing info. Credit card info. Billing info.
Use the down arrow to focus the next menu item.
so what we're doing here is actually more of an experience, like an illustration or a mock-up for developers to understand how the assistive tech should behave with a design. So like the designer is not actually building those modals. That's part of the assistive tech. And when I'll show you, if I hit Command F5, it'll turn on VoiceOver, and I get that experience. So by
VoiceOver on full screen.
Command Option U, Control Option U.
Quick response menu. Escape. VoiceOver off.
So illustrating how the assistive tech should behave will give you a point of conversation with developers on how to execute on your design. It's, I think, more of an illustrative exercise. Its annotations are sort of like core, like just tell me what I need to do, versus an assistive tech illustration of this is kind of how the experience should work. So when you build with annotations, that would be for things like accessible name, role, properties. If you want to show how someone might actually use it, you could use this template. And all of the components are here in that Dropbox download. So like the cursor, toggle VoiceOver, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. And I'll post some more assets to that Dropbox directory after this. I think I'm missing one or two. One other thing, in the spirit of developer handoff and annotations, you might have caught a glimpse of it. There's a plugin that we use to define how components should behave. This is sort of like a plugin that encapsulates a design system. And see if I can articulate this. The design system dictates what a button should look like, how it should behave, and ideally, its accessible name, properties, behavior, role. And we're starting to do that here. I have a way old version of this plugin. We're starting to do this with our internal plugins by adding an accessible name field, which should generally correspond to the actual title of a button. But if you have something that's just like a little edit icon, like a pencil icon that's a button, you'll need to specify some sort of alternative textual content, right? We know this. It's like the alt text I talked about earlier. And having a plugin-based system, which sadly I can't show you right now, but having a plugin-based system where you can annotate those elements is powerful. And that's kind of the direction that we're thinking about with that work. So, a couple other things. I wanted to touch on deaf and hard of hearing. This is, I hinted at this before when I was doing the like sort of lay-in exercise of, okay, voice first is great, but what if you can't hear? What if you don't communicate verbally? Then you'll want some sort of textual content that corresponds to the audio you're hearing. And that was, it's related to captions. Thank you, Mirabai, by the way. The voice content and the audio content should have a corresponding textual content on the page. You see how all of these things, it kind of makes sense. And then if you learn the WCAG principles, then you start to understand how design and usability and inclusive design come together with accessibility and compliance. Another point I wanted to make about deaf and hard of hearing is that Alexa actually has devices that have displays. So designing for a voice experience shouldn't necessarily be voice only. Designing in a multimodal way so that you can basically progressively enhance your design will support a wide array of users. Also, I've pulled up a picture of an Echo Show's accessibility features, including captioning and tap to Alexa. I don't have, well, we'll talk about this after. So generally, what I want you to take away from this is that when you're designing for accessibility, it's not about the tools, it's not about the plugins, it's not about the guidelines, the rules. It's about creating an experience that works for everyone, or at least the broadest range of people you can manage. And voice lets you do that, speech lets you do that, text lets you do that. Just keep building on top of all of those components, and you'll end up with something pretty good. Thank you. So I'm happy. We're here. We have this space. I'm warmed up. So I welcome questions. If you have like very specific technical questions, I'm happy to answer. If you have thoughts, if you have ideas, let's hear it.
And there's a mic that I'll bring around.
Yes, please wait for the mic so that we can get captions and live stream goodness.
So the annotations that you were showing us earlier, all of the like icons and stuff, you put them in your wireframes?
Yeah, you guys, well, you have a mic, so I'm not going to repeat the question. Yeah, the annotations that I showed earlier would actually be in the wireframes adjacent to the designs. So that's sort of the approach that you can take. It's frankly a workaround right now, but it's the best that any of the design tools can manage right now. And I think some of you as designers working in accessibility have some variation on that, right? Like red lines, essentially for accessibility. I look forward to sharing more about that soon.
I'm excited to hear it. Thanks.
Thanks.
Hi, I was wondering if you could talk a little bit more about either the possibilities or limitations of using what you showed to prototype and user test with blind users?
Yeah,
Or
sure.
just general screen
Yeah,
reader
yeah,
users?
absolutely. So the features that I just showed will work with a couple of exceptions on web. So you could share that voiceover experience that I just showed with a customer who's blind, who uses a screen reader. They'd have to turn off their screen reader when they were going to use this. But they could kind of smoke test your tool. I would recommend doing it in person and walking through it with someone. This is not really my opinion, my take on design tools in general and XD is that it's a tool, it's a communication tool. You're communicating with stakeholders, sort of pitching an idea, selling something, right? You're communicating with developers. Here are the specifications, right? I don't think that that aligns super well with user testing, at least for disability, because disability user testing is has a lot of parameters that you need to put in place, and it's hard to do that remotely. There are some tools. Correct me if I'm wrong here. Loop 11, they still do user testing. Usertesting.com has communities that you can tap into. So that's, if you want to talk about that afterwards, I'm happy to, well, you don't need to see my Twitter handle, but okay. If you want to talk about that afterwards, yeah, some more, come find me.
All right, here I come with the mic.
I just want to make sure that I'm being heard. Am I doing this right?
Yeah, I can hear you.
Okay, all right.
Yeah.
Sorry, I saw this button right here. Wasn't sure. Okay, it's just a power button. But I do have one question. So I see that Adobe XD is compatible with Apple VoiceOver for making your prototypes. What about the equivalent technology in Android? Can it be used for that as well?
Let me break that down. So everything that I showed, I designed in XD, including those overlays. So the components, so basically the short answer is yes, you could do the same thing for Android, but we don't have a UI kit per se for Android TalkBack. That could be something that could exist pretty easily with the voice command or with the speech playback features that I showed. Yeah. Does that make sense? You see what I mean with the components? So like here, these are actually components that I can edit So if I wanted to say like make this, you know, red, I could. This is where it gets really interesting, in my opinion, is not just recreating the user experience, but what if we could use XD to create new assistive technologies? What if we designed the next screen reader in Adobe XD? I think it's entirely plausible, and I'm excited to see what all of you do with it. I might beat you to the punch, but we can try. Yeah.
I do have another question. So maybe this is a bit simple, but let's say you want to make a interface, right, and it uses the speech recognition or screen reader to read the different parts of the components.
Sure.
If you're creating this prototype in Adobe XD, how would you switch it so that it also reads out in different languages?
The language support is across all Adobe or all XD supported languages. So if I set my operating system to be in France and I switch my XD language to French, it'll give you a variety of French playback voices, and it will recognize French speech. So it's globalized in that sense. There's a question behind you, Sean.
Thank you.
So in watching you design it for an app screen, it made me think less Google Home and more like a software solution. But I can't think off the top of my head of a really good example. So what's your favourite one that you've seen recently that I could go and have a look at?
Sorry, could you repeat that?
Sorry, what's your favourite solution of voice tech that you've recently used that I could go and explore and see how they've done it really well?
Solution using voice tech, voice control.
Yeah, so outside of like a Google Home or an Alexa.
So there was a big announcement at WWDC a few months ago showing voice control. It's a feature that has existed in Windows as well. I think the marketing around that is a really interesting illustration of how voice control can be meaningful for someone with a disability. Do you know which reel I'm talking about? It's a man who is using a wheelchair, has a motor disability, he's opening messages, he's opening maps, he's like creating an adventure where he like goes out into the world, and I think that was a really good illustration of how voice control can enhance someone's quality of life in addition to being just strictly a utility.
That's really cool.
Yeah, it's exciting. The voice control stuff in general is super exciting to me personally, and there's more there, but I need to keep my mouth shut.
Thank you.
All right, we have a question from the stream.
Yay!
Can you show an example with the annotations in the wireframe?
I don't have one here, but I'll share one on the Dropbox group tomorrow. Need to get some food. Yeah, the Dropbox link is on the Meetup page now. It's in the comments. So that has the annotations file and all of the other components, the voiceover components that I showed.
Any other questions here in the room? Yes. Here I come.
Hi. You've mentioned a lot about prototyping accessible experiences using XD, but I was curious what kind of support XD itself has for using XD like in an accessible way.
Yeah. Good question. Really good question. We have a couple ways of answering that. There's like the official answer, which is like you can go to adobe.com/accessibility, VPAT, whatever, and see like our official metrics, which would be appropriate. There's also more creative answers. such as you can open Accessibility Inspector and check it out. I encourage you to do that, but I'm not going to take a position on that. Try it out and tell me what you think. We do have a user group set up for pre-release for people who want to try voice control with Adobe XD. So if you want to be on that pre-release, let me know.
Thank you.
You're welcome.
Hello. I'm kind of new to designing for accessibility and inclusion.
Yes.
So my question is, if I had a prototype that was already built out,
Yep.
and I wanted to work backwards
Yeah.
with designing
Sure.
to make sure that it's accessible, what would that process look like using this method?
This approach that I just illustrated is very much like a greenfield design, right? Like you're starting from scratch, essentially. If I were to inherit a design, which is, let's be honest, more often the case than not, I would do a couple things. I would try to extract components from that design. So sort of like create a design system, a coherent set of components, and then start to break those down. And think about it, you can still think about it holistically as an interaction, but by chunking the components, you can start to break down the problem. Also, think about the kind of user flows that you're accommodating. Focus on the things that are high conversion, focus on the things that are core to the application. So for example, you could have a great product page, but if you can't check out, what's the point? I think this is where thinking about multimodal comes in handy, because, well, let's think about that for a second. And this is not the official accessibility answer, but what if we made an Alexa skill where you could check out, or Google Assistant skill where you could buy something from the website? Does that accommodate the requirements? I mean, you will have to decide, and it's a complicated question actually. Amazon, I guess famously, notoriously, has a separate accessible website, and it's problematic for reasons I think you can imagine. But I think it's more interesting now that we have voice experiences that are first class. And I think that's where voice assistants become interesting as an assistive technology, because we're designing for them at the forefront. It's not an afterthought. It's not something that's going to go and get stale or forgotten about. Like, if you build a voice assistant ability, you've got to own that, because it's not something you can write off as like, well, only a fraction of a % of our users ever even look at this, so if it gets out of date or is broken, maybe we don't prioritize it. If it's something that is more broadly used, then you don't have a choice. It forces the issue. Sorry, that kind of didn't, that like veered off, but to try to bring it back. If you inherit a design, what I would say is like, try to break it down into user journeys, identify the flows that you want to really focus on, and then within those flows, identify the behaviors and identify the components, and then just kind of create like a narrow path that you can accommodate. Even if you had to hold someone's hand, even if you had to get on the phone and like show them how to do it, like create that path and then start, get a wedge in there and like start expanding outside of that. Like, how do you go from accessible to actually inclusive? Yep.
Other questions? Kind of standing in the way. All right. Well, thank you so much.
Yes. Thank you.
And thank you to Whiteco Captioning and Internet Society of New York, as well as our long-term home ThoughtBot and brand new home Adobe. So we have a little more time here, so feel free to hang around. I'm sure Cameron's happy to answer more questions,
I'll be here.
and we'll see you next time. Thanks.